They found him in a small, damp room in the eastern quarters of a forgotten city. He was not wearing a crown of gold, nor was he speaking in the voice of thunder. He was bleeding, and his hands were calloused from the labor of a common man. This was the first great betrayal of history. For over a millennium, the highest order of the Silent City spent untold fortunes and discarded thousands of lives, not to find the one who was promised, but to ensure that if he ever returned, his voice would be extinguished before it could reach the ears of the world. This is not a story of faith, but a record of strategic execution. The archive suggests that the most powerful men in existence lived in a state of quiet, moral terror. They feared the return because the return would mean their end. They built a system of filters, a machine of archival suppression, to categorize every miracle as a fraud and every saint as a madman. They investigated the light only to find a way to dim it. Thousands of years of devotion were, in reality, a massive defense mechanism against the very truth they claimed to protect. This is the forbidden lie that was buried beneath the stone floors of the great cathedral. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold stone under your feet and the silence that only exists in places where secrets have been kept for centuries. We are entering the heart of the archive, where the ink is thick and the truth is heavy. Let the world outside fade away and listen to the rhythm of the past as it unfolds. Deep within the stone bowels of the Silent City, there exists a room that does not appear on any map. It is known to only a few as the Chamber of Failed Messengers. Here the air is thick with the dust of 10,000 scrolls, each one a meticulous record of a life that was scrutinized, judged, and eventually erased. The men who walked these halls were not mere librarians. They were the sentinels of the status quo. Their duty was to listen for the first whisper of a miracle and to move swiftly to silence it. In the winter of 1241, a specific ledger was opened. It did not contain prayers or hymns. It contained a list of names, 27 men and 3 women from across the known world, all of whom had performed acts that defied the laws of nature. The High Order did not dismiss these reports as folklore. On the contrary, they took them with a gravity that bordered on the clinical. They dispatched agents dressed as merchants and pilgrims to the furthest corners of the earth, not to bring these individuals back for worship, but to conduct what the documents describe as the final discernment. The final discernment was a process of psychological and physical testing designed to break the spirit of anyone who claimed a divine connection. If a man could heal the blind, the sentinels would ask who gave him the right to disrupt the natural order of suffering. If a woman spoke of visions of the future, they would search her history for a shadow of madness or a trace of political ambition. The moral fear that governed these halls was a cold and calculating one. It was the fear that if the divine truly walked among us, the structures of man would crumble like dry sand. The Church of the Silent City had become a kingdom of this world, and in a kingdom of stone, there is no room for a king of spirit. Consider the case recorded in the year 1298. A shepherd boy in the rugged hills of the north began to speak in languages he had never learned. He knew the names of the stars that had not yet been charted and the secrets of men he had never met. The reports reached the archive within 40 days. By the 41st day, the boy was no longer in the hills. He was brought to a cell beneath the cathedral, a place where the walls are 3 feet thick and the only sound is the dripping of water. They did not torture him in the traditional sense. They spoke to him in the rhythmic, hypnotic tones of the elite scholars, questioning his every memory until he no longer knew his own name. They looked for a flaw, a single human weakness they could use to prove he was not the one they feared. The archive reveals that the High Order was not looking for a savior to follow. They were looking for a candidate they could control. When they found someone whose power could not be bought or whose message could not be shaped to fit their dogma, that person became a threat to the very foundation of their power. The moral question that kept the high archivists awake at night was simple yet devastating. What if the Creator returned to his creation and found that his servants had built a wall to keep him out? What if the rejection of the holy was not an accident of history, but a deliberate policy of the powerful? Records from the Council of Lyons in 1274 hint at a secret session held after the main candles were extinguished. While the public discussed the reunion of the eastern and western branches of the faith, the inner circle was reviewing the reports of the silent witnesses. These were agents stationed in Jerusalem and Alexandria whose sole purpose was to monitor anomalous births. The decree of 1274, hidden in the margins of the official canon, authorized the use of any means necessary to prevent a premature restoration. This historical detail grounds our journey in the cold reality of medieval politics. The power was not in the prayer, but in the suppression of the answer. The documents describe the atmosphere of these investigations as quiet and reverent, yet deeply unsettling. There was no shouting, no anger. There was only the methodical scratching of quills on vellum as another life was analyzed and filed away. The sentinels believed they were doing a holy work. They believed that the world was not ready for the truth, and that by keeping the light hidden, they were protecting the fragile peace of the common people. But as you listen to the rhythmic pulse of this story, you must ask yourself whose peace they were truly protecting. Was it the peace of the soul, or the peace of the palace? The disappearance of the shepherd boy from the northern hills was not an isolated event, but rather the opening note in a symphony of silence that would span centuries. In the official records of the town, he was simply marked as a runaway, a child lost to the wolves or the harsh winter winds. But in the deep ledgers of the silent city, his departure was categorized as a successful containment. This was the first disappearance that set the template for everything that followed. The archivists began to realize that physical removal was only the first step. To truly protect the stability of the world, they had to remove the very memory of the individual from the minds of the people. This led to the creation of the Protocol of Shadows, a method of systematic cultural erasure where even the mention of a miracle was treated as a symptom of a deeper, more dangerous contagion. The rooms where these people were kept were designed to be unremarkable. There were no chains or iron bars, for the sentinels knew that a martyr is born in the struggle against visible oppression. Instead, they used the weight of time and the erosion of identity. The candidates were treated with a terrifying clinical kindness. They were fed well, given clean clothes, and spoken to in soft, intellectual tones. The goal was to make them feel that their extraordinary abilities were merely a misunderstanding of the natural world. They were told that their visions were exhaustion, and their miracles were simply coincidences of timing. After years of this subtle psychological pressure, the fire that burned within them would often flicker and die. The world outside would move on, the legend would fade, and eventually, the individual would simply cease to be a threat. But what of the ones who did not break? What of the few who looked into the eyes of the high inquisitors and saw not authority, but fear? The archives are surprisingly candid about these failures. There are folders marked with a red seal, indicating a subject who remained resonant even in total isolation. In these cases, the high order faced their greatest moral dilemma. If they could not disprove the divinity of the person, they had to justify their rejection of it on a cosmic scale. They argued that even if a new truth was revealed, the preservation of the existing order was a higher duty to humanity. They chose the structure over the spirit, believing that a world governed by predictable laws was safer than a world governed by the whims of the divine dot in the summer of 1310. The archives record the trial of a mystic whose influence had begun to seep into the royal courts of Europe. While public history focuses on the spectacular trials of the Templars during this decade, the secret files of the Silent City reveal a much more focused operation. On June 1, 1310, a specific decree was signed that authorized the seizure of all private journals belonging to the followers of the Mirror of Souls. The detail that remains chilling to modern researchers is the meticulous inventory of items taken from the mystic's cell. They did not find weapons or gold. They found a collection of common river stones that appeared to glow with a faint internal light when held by the prisoner. The stones were confiscated and placed in a lead-lined chest in the lower vaults, where they remain to this day. Their origin and nature never officially explained, but deeply feared by those who guard them. The weight of this responsibility began to take a heavy toll on the men who managed the archive. We see this in the personal letters of the chief archivists, which were often preserved alongside the very secrets they were meant to hide. One such man, writing in the late 14th century, spoke of a recurring dream where the cathedral was not a place of worship, but a massive stone lid holding down a boiling sea. He wrote of the moral fear that one day the lid would crack, and the truth they had buried for so long would come rushing out with a force that would wash away every king, priest, and scholar in existence. He questioned if they were truly the protectors of the faith or the jailers of the light. This moral fear was compounded by the realization that some of the candidates they rejected were truly innocent. They were not seeking power or looking to start a revolution. They were simply vessels for something they did not fully understand. To see a person of pure heart be subjected to the clinical machinery of the Silent City was a burden that led many archivists to seek their own forms of penance. Some joined the most ascetic orders, spending their remaining years in total silence to atone for the words they had used to break the spirits of others. Others left the city entirely, wandering the edges of the map in search of the very miracles they had spent their lives suppressing. As we move deeper into the record, a strange pattern begins to emerge in the reports of the field agents. Between the years 1350 and 1450, every agent who was assigned to investigate a healer in the regions of the Black Forest eventually reported the same sensory anomaly. They claimed that the ink in their journals would turn a deep, vibrant blue whenever they were within 10 miles of a potential subject. More unsettlingly, after the subject was removed and taken to the Silent City, the agent would slowly lose the ability to see the color blue altogether. Why did the archive demand the sacrifice of a man's vision to maintain the secrecy of its mission? And what was it about these specific healers that left a permanent stain on the very perception of reality? The atmosphere of the archive during this period was one of quiet, desperate vigilance. The plague was ravaging the world outside, and with it came a surge of desperate people looking for a savior. The sentinels were working at a pace they had never experienced before. Every village had a story of a miracle, and every city had a new prophet. The archive grew by leaps and bounds as thousands of cases were processed. The morality of their mission was tested like never before. In a world of such immense suffering, was it truly an act of holiness to deny the people a glimpse of hope? The High Order believed that hope was a dangerous thing, a spark that could lead to a wildfire of chaos. They preferred the cold, predictable shadow of the stone walls. As you listen to the steady, rhythmic flow of these accounts, let your mind rest on the image of the great stone doors. They are thick, ancient, and silent. Behind them lies the history we were never meant to know. The names of those who were lost to the protocol of shadows whisper through the cracks in the masonry, a soft, persistent sound like the turning of a page in a room where no one is sitting. The truth is not a loud shout, it is a quiet, steady pressure that never truly goes away. The corridors of the silent city grew longer and narrower as the centuries pressed down upon them. By the dawn of the 16th century, the archive had become more than just a repository of documents. It had evolved into a living, breathing architecture of denial. The Sentinels now utilized a specialized floor known as the Gallery of the Unnamed. Here, the portraits of the candidates were hung, but their faces were intentionally left blank. The High Order believed that even a painted likeness could hold a residual power, a visual spark that might ignite the curiosity of a future researcher. To walk through this gallery is to walk through a crowd of ghosts, each one a potential savior who was deemed a threat to the equilibrium of the world. As the age of discovery began to unfold, the mission of the archive expanded across the oceans. It was no longer enough to monitor the villages of Europe. The Sentinels were sent on the great ships, disguised as cartographers and surgeons, with a secret directive to watch for the anointed. Among the civilizations of the New World, the reports that returned were filled with a mixture of awe and clinical coldness. They described leaders who could command the elements and healers whose touch could knit bone and flesh in an instant. These individuals were not brought back to the Silent City. The logistics were too difficult, and the risk of their influence spreading among the sailors was too high. Instead, the archive authorized neutralization in situ, a term that appears for the first time in the records of 1521. The moral fear had shifted from a local concern to a global one. The High Order realized that the divine was not confined to their own geography. This realization shook the very foundation of their dogma. If the truth could appear anywhere, in any culture, and under any name, then the Silent City's claim to be the sole gatekeeper was a fragile illusion. They responded to this existential threat by becoming even more rigid. They developed a complex system of linguistic sanitization, ensuring that any account of a miracle in a foreign tongue was translated into the language of heresy or madness before it ever reached the ears of the public. In the autumn of 1582, the world witnessed the Great Correction. While history books record this as the implementation of the Gregorian calendar to fix a 10-day drift in the solar year, the archive tells a different story. The secret files from October of that year reveal that the lost 10 days were not merely a mathematical adjustment. They were a strategic blackout. During those 10 days that never officially existed for the public, the High Order conducted its largest ever grand discernment. They moved over 400 sensitive artifacts and 30 candidates from various hidden locations across Europe to a newly fortified vault beneath the Mediterranean. The calendar shift provided the perfect temporal fog to mask a mass relocation that would have otherwise drawn the eyes of every king in Christendom. The loss of those 10 days in the minds of the populace was a small price to pay for the absolute security of the Order's most dangerous secrets, the atmosphere in the subterranean vaults during this period was one of intensified ritual. The librarians began to wear masks made of soft, unpainted leather, symbolizing their role as faceless instruments of the archive's will. They moved in total silence, using a complex system of hand signals to communicate. This was not just for the sake of quiet. It was a psychological defense. By removing the human voice from the work, they hoped to insulate themselves from the persuasive power of the truths they were burying. They had learned that the words of the anointed were contagious, capable of taking root in the mind of a researcher and blossoming into a doubt that could dismantle a lifetime of service. 1. Particular file from the mid-17th century stands out for its sheer emotional weight. It concerns a woman from the lowlands who possessed the ability to see the internal light of anyone she looked upon. She did not perform miracles in the traditional sense, but she could speak to the hidden burdens of the soul with such precision that men were moved to tears of profound relief. The sentinels kept her in the archive for 20 years. Unlike others who were broken by the silence, she seemed to thrive in it. The journals of her primary keeper describe how she would sit for hours, staring at the cold stone walls as if she were watching a sunrise. She never argued, never pleaded for her release. She simply waited. Her presence became so unsettling to the high order that they eventually moved her to a cell that was completely flooded with light, 24 hours a day in an attempt to wash out her internal vision. Even then, the records say she died with a smile that the archivists could not explain. As you drift deeper into the rhythm of this history, consider the weight of those 20 years. The archive was not just a place of storage, it was a place of transformation. It took the infinite and tried to make it finite. It took the radiant and tried to make it dull. The people who lived and died within these walls are the forgotten pillars of our reality. Our world remains the way it is because they were prevented from changing it. The stability we enjoy is built upon the silence of those who were never allowed to speak. The archive contains a single, recurring sketch found in the margins of nearly every ledger from the year 1665. It is a simple drawing of a key, but the teeth of the key are shaped like the silhouette of a mountain range that does not exist on any map. For centuries, the librarians have debated whether this is a literal key to a physical door or a metaphorical key to the code of the returned. But there is a more haunting question that remains unanswered. Why did 3 separate archivists in 3 different centuries all describe hearing the sound of a heavy iron key turning in a lock exactly 7 minutes before a candidate passed away? Is it possible that the archive is not the one holding the key, but is itself the lock being turned from the other side? The narration continues through the cold, echoing halls, moving toward the modern era. The flickering torches of the past are replaced by the steady, clinical glow of the Enlightenment, yet the shadows remain just as deep. The High Order did not disappear as the world became more rational. It simply adapted. It traded the robe for the suit and the quill for the printing press, but the moral fear remained unchanged. The return was still the ultimate threat, and the archive was still the ultimate shield. The transition into the industrial age brought a new kind of silence to the halls of the High Order. As the world began to rely on the cold logic of steel and steam, the sentinels realized that the most effective way to hide a miracle was not to bury it in a stone cell, but to drown it in a sea of mundane data. They moved away from the damp vaults of the medieval era and established the first modern bureaucratic filters. They realized that if a man performed a miracle in a factory, the public would not call it divine. They would call it a malfunction or a trick of the light. The moral fear that had once governed the stone chambers now evolved into a sophisticated campaign of intellectual suppression. They funded the first great skeptical societies not to find the truth, but to provide a prepackaged explanation for anything that defied the new laws of physics. By the time the 20th century arrived, the archive had become a digital fortress. The vellum scrolls were scanned and encrypted, hidden behind layers of firewalls and state-sponsored secrecy. The sentinels of today do not wear leather masks or carry flickering torches. They sit in temperature-controlled rooms in the great capitals of the world, monitoring global search trends and social media pulses. They look for the anomalous signal, the one piece of information that does not fit the narrative of a predictable, materialist world. They have perfected the art of the memory hole, ensuring that any video of a true miracle is flagged as a hoax or a deepfake before it can reach 1 million views. The goal remains the same as it was in the year 1241, to ensure that if the light ever breaks through the clouds, the world is too distracted by the shadows to notice. Yet, despite this total saturation of control, the High Order remains in a state of quiet, perpetual tension. The archives reveal that the more they try to compress the truth, the more explosive it becomes. The moral fear has shifted from a religious concern to a systemic one. They understand that our entire modern reality, with its financial markets, political structures, and social contracts, is built on the assumption that no higher power will ever intervene. If a single true savior were to be recognized by the masses, the entire delicate architecture of the Tier 1 world would collapse in a single afternoon. They are not protecting your soul. They are protecting the stock market. They are not guarding the gates of heaven. They are guarding the stability of the grid. This is the ultimate forbidden lie that was buried beneath the foundation of our progress. As the heavy weight of sleep begins to settle over you, consider the final entry in the modern ledger. It is not a record of a victory, but a warning. It states that the return is not a single event in time, but a recurring pressure against the fabric of our world. Every time a person chooses compassion over profit or wonder over cynicism, a small crack appears in the walls of the archive. The failed return mentioned in the ancient scrolls was not a failure of the divine, but a temporary success of the jailers. But stone crumbles and servers eventually fail. The silence is only a pause in a much longer conversation. The truth is patient, and it does not require your belief to exist. It simply waits for the moment when the world is quiet enough to hear it. The king did not leave, he was merely hidden. And what is hidden eventually finds its way back to the light, but even as the great archive monitors the silence, a new file has appeared on the High Sentinel screen, one that cannot be deleted. Deep in the heart of a city that never sleeps, a man has been found who does not cast a shadow, and every clock in his presence has begun to run backward toward the year of the first disappearance. What happens when the archive realizes that the lock is no longer holding and the one they feared has already walked past the gates? Imagine a man who can stand in the center of a raging inferno and emerge with the scent of lilac on his skin. Imagine a woman who can speak a word and watch a withered limb knit itself back into wholeness before a crowd of 1,000 witnesses. For the ruling elite of the ancient world, these individuals were not causes for celebration. They were the ultimate security threat. This is the great betrayal of our collective history. The powers that governed from the hills of Rome did not fear false prophets. They knew how to handle liars and magicians. What they truly feared were the ones they could not prove were lying. They encountered men who walked with a weight of authority that made legions hesitate and emperors tremble in their private chambers. They were faced with the impossible task of categorizing a divinity that refused to be contained by their laws or their temples. To acknowledge them was to surrender the throne. To kill them was to risk a spark that would burn the empire to the ground. So, they chose the path of the forbidden shadow. They created a secret archive of the unclassifiable, a list of names that were never to be spoken again. They buried the evidence of a higher reality to maintain the illusion of their own. This is the secret curse of the silent centuries. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cool, smooth surface of a marble floor beneath your feet and the heavy, still air of a vault that has not been opened in 1,000 years. The world outside is a distant memory. Here, in the heart of the archive, the only sound is the rhythmic, steady pulse of time itself. Let your mind settle into the shadows as we uncover the records of the men that Rome could not call false and could not call divine. The records of the High Council describe a period of profound moral tension that stretched across the reigns of a dozen emperors. It was a time when the boundary between the mundane and the miraculous began to fray at the edges. The officials in charge of the census started reporting anomalies that defied every bureaucratic logic. They found men in the provinces of the east who did not age, and women in the northern forests who could command the flight of birds with a whisper. These were not the common sorcerers who worked for coin in the marketplaces. These individuals lived in a state of quiet, terrifying simplicity. They sought no power, yet power seemed to flow from them like water from a mountain spring. The psychological profiles of these candidates remain some of the most unsettling documents in the entire archive. The Roman observers, trained in the art of cold, clinical detachment, found themselves struggling to maintain their composure. They wrote of a specific kind of weight that these individuals carried in their presence. It was not a physical weight, but a psychological pressure that made it difficult to breathe or to think in the usual patterns of doubt. One report, written by a seasoned centurion who had survived 20 years of frontier warfare, described a young man in Judea whose eyes seemed to hold the reflected light of a sun that had not yet risen. The centurion noted that in the presence of this man, the desire to draw a sword or issue a command simply evaporated, replaced by a profound and unwelcome sense of peace. This was the core of the Roman dilemma. If a man is a fraud, you expose him. If a man is a rebel, you execute him. But what do you do with a man who is neither? What do you do with a man whose very existence makes the structures of the state feel like a childish game? The internal debates of the secret councils were filled with a slow-burn dread. The senators and high priests understood that belief was far more dangerous than heresy. A heretic challenges the interpretation of the law, but a true messenger of the divine makes the law irrelevant. They realized that if the people were to see these individuals as they truly were, the divine right of the emperor would vanish like mist in the morning sun. In the spring of 112 AD. During the reign of Trajan, a private letter was dispatched from the governor Pliny the Younger to the imperial court. While history remembers their public correspondence regarding the treatment of early secret societies, the archive contains a secondary, unredacted scroll. In it, Pliny describes a subject alpha held in a villa outside Ephesus. This individual apparently possessed a voice that resonated at a frequency that caused glass to shatter and stone to hairline fracture. Pliny noted that the subject refused to eat or sleep, yet remained in a state of perfect, radiant health. The governor's primary concern was not the man's theology, but the fact that the local guard had begun to abandon their posts just to sit in silence outside his door. This detail provides a historical anchor for the birth of the policy of silence. It was on June 14th of that year that the directive was issued. The subject was to be moved to a location where the air does not carry sound, marking the first recorded instance of state-mandated erasure. The invention of silence as a formal policy was a masterpiece of cold administrative genius. The order realized that execution only creates martyrs and martyrs create movements. To truly defeat the divine, they had to ensure that it was never officially recognized. They developed a series of psychological filters to deal with the most convincing candidates. They would isolate the individual in an environment of total, suffocating normalcy. They would provide them with every comfort, every distraction, and every intellectual argument to prove that their gifts were merely a strange, natural fluke. They wanted to make the miraculous feel boring. They wanted to turn a cosmic event into a medical curiosity dot as you listen to the steady, rhythmic flow of this narrative. Imagine the sheer effort required to maintain this curtain of silence. Thousands of scrolls were written, then hidden. Thousands of witnesses were bribed, moved, or quietly silenced. The Roman state became a massive machine of suppression, working night and day to keep the world from waking up. The moral tension within the council members was immense. They were men of education and philosophy, and many of them privately believed that they were witnessing the return of the gods. Yet they continued their work, driven by a fear that was not personal, but systemic. They were the guardians of the world as it was, and they were willing to sacrifice the truth to keep the world from changing. As the scrolls of the candidate ledger grew thicker, the high order began to notice a disturbing trend in the psychological profiles of those they brought into the deep chambers. These were not men and women seeking an audience or craving the adoration of the masses. In fact, most of them seemed entirely indifferent to their own extraordinary nature. They possessed a quality the archivists began to call inherent weight. It was a sense of presence so profound that it seemed to anchor the very air around them. When a candidate sat in a room, the dust motes appeared to move with a different rhythm, and the light seemed to cling to their skin with a soft, unnatural intensity. The researchers noted that these individuals did not exhibit the typical signs of religious mania or grandiosity. They spoke with a terrifyingly calm precision, often describing complex celestial mechanics or the inner workings of the human heart, as if they were discussing the weather. One specific profile in the archive details a woman found in a small coastal village near the Levant. She did not perform grand miracles to prove her worth. Instead, she spent her days sitting by the water, and it was said that whenever she spoke, the waves would smooth into a mirror-like glass for miles in every direction. When the sentinels arrived to take her, she did not resist. She simply looked at the lead investigator and told him the exact date and hour of his own father's death, a secret he had never shared with a living soul. The report notes that for 3 days after this encounter, the investigator was unable to form a coherent sentence, his mind completely paralyzed by the effortless certainty in her voice. This was the psychological threat that Rome could not quantify. They were dealing with an authority that didn't need to shout to be heard, and a truth that didn't need to argue to be felt. In the summer of 161 AD, during the transition of power to Marcus Aurelius, a secret census was conducted in the province of Alexandria. While official history focuses on the Antonine Plague and the wars on the Danube, the hidden ledgers record the arrival of a silent envoy. From the high order, this envoy was tasked with investigating a group of scholars who had supposedly discovered a manuscript that revealed the true names of the 7 candidates held in the vaults of the capital. On July 12th of that year, every copy of this manuscript was seized and burned in the courtyard of the Great Library. The historical record was wiped clean, but the archive preserves a single scrap of parchment that survived the flames. It contains a list of coordinates in the Egyptian desert where the shadowless men were said to gather once every century. This precise date and event marked the moment the archive shifted from a reactive body to a proactive force of global surveillance. The internal debates within the secret councils of the Silent City became increasingly desperate as the 2nd century progressed. High-ranking officials, men who had spent their lives studying the philosophy of Stoicism and the laws of the state, found themselves divided. One faction argued that to hide these individuals was a crime against the natural order, a betrayal of the very gods they claimed to serve. They believed that the world was being denied a necessary evolution. The opposing faction, led by the master of the archive, maintained that the world was far too fragile for such a heavy truth. They argued that the common man requires the comfort of the predictable, and that to introduce a living divinity into the social fabric would be like dropping a boulder into a pool of thin glass. The invention of policy silence was the compromise that saved the empire from internal collapse. It was decided that these individuals would be neither executed nor deified. Instead, they would be categorized as non-existent. Their names were removed from tax rolls, their families were given new identities in distant provinces, and their homes were razed to the ground. In the eyes of the law, they had never been born. This was a form of living death that was far more effective than the cross or the arena. It removed the candidate from the narrative of history entirely. The psychological toll on the candidates was immense. Yet the record suggests they bore this erasure with a grace that only added to the archivists' secret dread. Deep within the restricted wing of the archive, there is a small obsidian box that is never to be opened. According to the oral tradition of the Sentinels, this box contains the shadows of 3 candidates who were brought to the Silent City. In the year 185 AD, the scrolls claim that during the final discernment, these men reached a state of such high resonance that their shadows detached from their bodies and began to move independently across the stone walls. The men eventually faded into nothingness, leaving behind only these dark, flickering silhouettes. To this day, the guards of the lower vault claim they can hear a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from inside the obsidian, a sound that perfectly matches the heartbeat of whoever is standing closest to it. Is it possible that the candidates did not disappear, but were simply folded into a dimension that the archive cannot reach? And if their shadows are still here, whose heart are they truly following? The narration drifts further into the cold, rhythmic heart of the mystery, where the scent of old ink and the chill of the stone walls create a sanctuary of forbidden knowledge. The archive was becoming a cathedral of the unsaid, a place where the most profound truths were kept in a state of permanent hibernation. The moral tension was no longer about whether the candidates were real, but about how long the world could be kept in the dark before the light found a way to bleed through the cracks. Every sentence written in the ledger was a brick in a wall that was never intended to be finished. The secret councils that governed the archive began to meet with increasing frequency as the 3rd century approached, a time when the external world was fracturing under the weight of civil war and economic collapse. These meetings did not take place in the grand halls of the Senate, but in a series of lead-lined chambers beneath the Palatine Hill, where the walls were thick enough to dampen the sound of 1,000 shouting men. The members of these councils were not just politicians, they were the architects of perception. They understood that their greatest enemy was not a rival general or a barbarian horde, but the infectious nature of a true miracle. They debated the resonance factor of each candidate, calculating the exact probability that a single act of healing or a single word of forbidden wisdom could trigger a cascade of belief that would bypass every existing structure of power. The invention of silence as a formal policy was not a sudden decision, but a slow and careful refinement of psychological warfare. The council members realized that to deny a miracle was to give it power, but to ignore it was to starve it of the oxygen of attention. They developed a doctrine known as the veil of ordinary time. This required that any extraordinary event be immediately surrounded by a cluster of mundane, contradictory explanations. If a candidate walked through a locked door, the official record would reflect a faulty latch or a distracted guard. If a candidate spoke in a voice that could be heard across a city, the record would describe a unique atmospheric condition or a localized mass hallucination. They built a world where the truth was not suppressed by force, but drowned out by the noise of the mediocre dot in the early winter of 235 AD. During the chaotic transition of the imperial crisis, a specific inventory was conducted within the hidden vaults of the archive. While mainstream history remembers the rise of Maximinus Thrax and the beginning of a 50-year period of instability, the secret files reveal a much more focused event. On November 22nd of that year, the High Archivist ordered the permanent sealing of Solus Scroll. This document, allegedly written by a former member of the Praetorian Guard who had served as a jailer for one of the shadowless candidates, contained a detailed map of a subterranean network beneath the city of Ephesus. The scroll noted that the stone in this location reacted to the human voice by vibrating at a frequency that could harmonize with the pulse of the earth itself. The decision to seal this map was based on the fear that the resonance could be used to amplify a divine signal to the point of global recognition. This precise historical detail highlights the moment. The archive transitioned from monitoring individuals to monitoring the physical geography of the sacred, the psychological. Burden of these secret councils was immense, leading to a phenomenon the records describe as the scribes' melancholy. The men tasked with documenting the impossible found that their own grip on reality began to slip. They spent their days analyzing lives that defied every law they had been taught to uphold. One high-ranking counselor, writing in his private journals in 248 AD, confessed that he no longer trusted the evidence of his own eyes. He wrote that the stone of the city felt like paper, and the authority of the empire felt like a dream from which he could not wake. He questioned why they were working so hard to protect a world of shadows when the light was standing right in front of them, waiting to be acknowledged. This moral tension was exacerbated by the realization that belief was far more dangerous than heresy. A heretic still operates within the framework of the system, arguing over definitions and interpretations. But a believer, a true believer who has witnessed the unclassifiable, operates outside the system entirely. They no longer fear the law because they have seen a higher law. They no longer value the coin because they have seen a wealth that cannot be minted. The archive's primary mission was to prevent this state of transcendental autonomy from spreading. They realized that a population that truly believed in a living divinity could not be governed by traditional means. They would be immune to fear, immune to greed, and eventually immune to the state itself. Hidden in the back of the 3rd century ledger is a series of charcoal sketches depicting a set of iron gates that lead to nowhere. For centuries, the junior archivists have joked that these are the gates of the forgotten, but the master records suggest a much darker purpose. The notes accompanying the sketches indicate that these gates were built inside a vacuum-sealed chamber in the year 270 AD, according to the testimony of the lead mason. The gates do not open into another room, but into a pocket of static time, where a candidate from the 1st century is still being held in a state of perpetual suspension. The records claim that if you press your ear against the cold iron, you can hear a heartbeat that only occurs once every 24 hours. Why would the archive go to such lengths to keep a single heart beating across the centuries? And what happens to the rhythm of our own world if that heart ever chooses to stop? The atmosphere of the narration remains heavy and rhythmic, a slow-burn journey through the corridors of a power that fears nothing more than the truth it was meant to serve. The silent halls of the archive continue to echo with the unsaid, a reminder that the world we see is only a thin crust over a deep and glowing sea. The sentinels continue their work, moving with a whispered certainty that their silence is the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. But as you drift toward sleep, you must wonder if they are guarding the world, or if they are simply guarding the locked-up by the late 4th century. The Roman state had become a hollow shell, but the archive was more robust than ever. As the physical borders of the empire began to dissolve under the pressure of the Great Migration, the Sentinels realized that their mission had surpassed the survival of any single city or emperor. They were no longer guarding a political entity, they were guarding a version of reality itself. The records from the year 395 AD describe a frantic effort to transcribe the most sensitive scrolls into a code that would survive the coming Dark Ages. They understood that while the marble statues might be toppled and the libraries burned, the policy of silence had to remain intact. They sought out the most remote monasteries and the deepest mountain caves, handing over the ledgers to a new generation of guardians who had been trained to value the secret over the self. The final realization of the Roman Council was the most terrifying of all. They had spent centuries analyzing the candidates, looking for flaws and building walls of silence. But in the final years of the Western record, a high-ranking archivist noted a recurring phrase in the testimony of several different subjects who had never met. They all claimed that the archive was not a cage designed to keep them in, but a nursery designed to keep the world out until it was ready. The moral dread that had once been a fear of losing power became a fear of the inevitable. The Sentinels began to suspect that they were not the jailers of the divine, but the unwilling witnesses to a long and careful gestation. They realized that every name they had erased was a seed planted in the deep soil of history, waiting for a season that the Roman mind could not even imagine. As the heavy, rhythmic darkness of the story folds around you, let your thoughts rest. On the image of the last Roman sentinel closing the final ledger. The ink is dry, the candles are low, and the air is filled with the scent of ancient dust. The silence is now complete. The men Rome could not call false were never truly silenced. They were merely moved into the quiet spaces between the words of history. They are the whispers in the static of the modern world, the shadowless figures in the corner of your vision, and the sudden, unexplainable peace that descends when the noise of the world finally fades away. But even as the Roman record ends, the secret did not die with the empire. Deep in the forgotten corners of the medieval world, a new map was being drawn in blood and gold, leading to a location that the Romans had specifically forbidden any man to enter. Somewhere in the heart of the great desert, a door was being built that required no key, and the first person to walk through it was someone whose name had been erased 300 years before he was born. What did the new guardians find when they finally dared to look inside the room that Rome had tried to delete from existence? Imagine a library where every book is a death warrant for a miracle. Imagine a chamber where the air is thick with the dust of names that were methodically stripped from the fabric of human memory. This is the ultimate betrayal of our shared history. For nearly 2,000 years, a hidden collective of scholars, linguists, and silent men worked in the absolute dark to ensure that the light would never reach your eyes. They did not merely hide these records, they executed a forbidden strategy of total cultural erasure. They saw men heal the broken and heard women speak with the voice of the stars, and then they sat down to decide how to kill the memory of it. This was a secret curse, a global lie maintained by generations of men who believed they were saving the world by keeping it blind. They categorized the divine as a contagion and treated the truth as a heresy that had to be buried under 10 feet of stone. When the keepers of these secrets finally succumbed to the power of what they were guarding, they too were vanished into the shadows of the vaults. The archive does not just hold books, it holds the ghosts of those who tried to tell the truth. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, heavy atmosphere of a vault carved directly into the living rock of an ancient mountain. There are no windows here, only the steady, rhythmic flicker of oil lamps that have burned for centuries without failing. You are standing at the entrance of the great void, the archive of the unseen. Let the world above vanish, and listen to the silence of the stones as they prepare to speak. The archive is not a single room, but a vast, sprawling geography of suppressed knowledge. It is a labyrinth of iron and ink, divided into sectors that represent the different ways a truth can be hidden. There is the sector of the unborn, where records of individuals with anomalous potential were kept before they could ever reach the public eye. There is the sector of the echo, which contains transcripts of every forbidden sermon and every whispered prophecy that managed to escape the walls of a local village. To enter this place, one must undergo a ritual of absolute sensory deprivation. The scribes were chosen not for their intellectual prowess, but for their lack of ties to the world of men. They were the orphans of the spirit, men and women who had no families, no ambitions, and a willingness to become a ghost before they were even dead. The access rules of the archive were governed by the law of the third key. No single person, not even the High Chancellor, was permitted to enter the deep vaults alone. Every door required 3 keys, held by 3 separate keepers who lived in total isolation from one another. This was not just a security measure against theft, it was a defense against the truth itself. The order knew that the information contained within these walls was so potent that it could shatter the mind of anyone who engaged with it in its entirety. By dividing the keys, they divided the burden of the secret dot in the spring of 1451. A specific decree was signed by the Council of the Iron Seal, an event that predates the formal establishment of many modern libraries. This decree, known as the Lex Silentium, mandated the construction of a specialized sub-vault designated as Room 44. This room was not intended for books, but for resonant objects. These were items found in the possession of the candidates, objects that appeared to defy the standard laws of physics. On July 12, 1451, a lead-lined chest containing a piece of cloth that allegedly emitted a constant, low-frequency hum was placed in Room 44. The historical record shows that the two masons who sealed the door to this room were never seen in public again, their names removed from the guild rolls of the city within 48 hours of the room's completion. This detail anchors the archive in a reality where the cost of a secret was often the life of the one who held it. The daily life within the archive was a study in rhythmic monotony. The scribes moved like clockwork, their feet muffled by soft leather slippers, their hands gloved in silk to protect the fragile vellum. They did not speak. They used a complex system of hand signals to communicate their needs, a language of the fingers that was as old as the vaults themselves. This silence was not merely a rule, it was a sanctuary, in a place filled with the weight of forbidden words. The absence of sound was the only thing that kept the scribes from losing their sanity. They spent decades copying documents they were forbidden to understand, their eyes moving over scripts that described the impossible while their hearts remained locked in a state of clinical detachment. As you listen to the steady, rhythmic flow of this narrative, imagine the sheer volume of what has been lost. For every name you know from history, there are 1,000 names that were deliberately deleted. The archive holds the records of the failed apostles, the men and women who possessed the same fire as the saints but were caught by the sentinels before their spark could ignite the world. Their stories were not just hidden, they were rewritten. A miracle worker became a common criminal in the official histories. A visionary was transformed into a madman in the local legends. The archive was the factory where the reality of the world was manufactured, ensuring that the population remained in a state of manageable, predictable normalcy. The disappearance of the record keepers was a phenomenon that the high order eventually came to accept as an occupational hazard. These were not men who fled into the night to escape their duties. On the contrary, the record suggests that they became so consumed by the truths they were copying that they simply lost the ability to exist in a world governed by time and gravity. One day, a scribe would be at his desk, his quill moving with rhythmic precision over the vellum. The next morning, the desk would be empty, the lamp still warm, and the unfinished sentence would trail off into a splash of ink that refused to dry. These vanishings were never investigated by the local authorities, for the archive operated in a jurisdiction that did not belong to any king. The empty cells were merely cleaned, the robes were burned, and a new orphan was brought in to take the place of the one who had been folded into the silence. The psychological toll on those who remained was documented in a series of confessional ledgers that were never intended to be read by anyone outside the inner circle. These books reveal a deep, slow-burn madness that afflicted the most dedicated scholars. They began to speak of the weight of the unsaid, a physical sensation of pressure in their chests that occurred whenever they were forced to redact a particularly beautiful or profound truth. They felt they were murdering the future one word at a time. To cope with this moral betrayal, some scribes began to hide micro-fragments of the original texts in the margins of mundane administrative reports, hoping that a future reader would have the eyes to see the light. Hidden within the bureaucracy got in the late autumn of 1342, a high-ranking librarian named Brother Thomas of Kent was tasked with the final categorization of the Aletheia scrolls, a set of documents recovered from a sunken vessel off the coast of Crete. The scrolls allegedly contained the verbatim transcripts of a conversation between a Roman centurion and a candidate who could make the sun appear to stand still in the sky for 3 minutes. On October 14, 1342, Brother Thomas recorded in the archive's central log that he had finished the work and was ready to seal the vault. When the 3 key holders arrived to lock the door, they found the room completely empty of both the scrolls and the librarian. The only thing remaining was a single, fresh white lily sitting on the center of the table, despite it being the middle of a harsh, freezing winter. This historical event marked the implementation of the witness protocol, requiring that no scribe ever be left alone with a high priority. Document for more than 60 minutes. As you drift further into the rhythmic pulse of this story, consider the nature of the confessions that were suppressed. These were not admissions of sin in the traditional sense. They were admissions of belief. A monk would confess to his superior that he no longer believed in the authority of the church, not because he had lost his faith, but because he had seen too much evidence of a higher reality that the church was actively hiding. He would describe the moral tension of living in a world of manufactured shadows while holding the keys to a sunlit kingdom. These confessions were treated with a terrifying clinical coldness. The monk would not be punished, but he would be reassigned to the deep vaults, where he would never see another human face again. The order knew that the greatest threat to their control was not the candidate, but the conversion of the guards. The archive itself seemed to possess a living, breathing awareness. The scribes often noted that the temperature in certain rooms would drop 40 degrees in a matter of seconds whenever a document regarding the third return was opened. They spoke of the static hum, a low, vibrating sound that would permeate the stone walls during the nights of the Great Discernment. This was the psychological layer of the archive, an environment designed to keep the human mind in a state of perpetual, low-level dread. If you are afraid of the dark, you will not look too closely at what is hidden within it. The high order used this primitive fear to ensure that even the most curious researchers would eventually retreat back into the safety of the official narrative. Deep within the restricted archives of the 16th century, there is a recurring mention of a mirror that remembers. The legends say this mirror was not a physical object, but a polished slab of obsidian found in the cell of a candidate who had vanished in 1502. The scrolls claim that if a person looks into this slab, they do not see their own reflection, but the reflection of the person who stood there exactly 100 years before. The archive has spent centuries trying to determine if this is a literal temporal anomaly or a psychological projection of the viewer's own buried secrets. But there is a question that the High Chancellor refused to answer in the final report of 1890. Why? Did every researcher who spent more than an hour staring into the obsidian eventually begin to speak in a language that has not been heard on Earth for 3,000 years? And what are they trying to tell us about the faces we will see when we finally look into the mirror of our own future? The narration continues through the intimate, heavy atmosphere of the vaults, moving into the era where the Church's control began to clash explicitly with the rising tide of the Enlightenment. The archive was no longer just a warehouse of papers, it was a battlefield for the soul of humanity. Every name removed from history was a victory for the state, but a loss for the spirit. The men who managed the silence were becoming increasingly desperate, realizing that the more they hid, the more the truth began to exert its own gravity, pulling on the edges of reality until the walls of the archive themselves began to groan under the pressure. The moral architecture of the high order began to crack during the age of the Enlightenment, a period when the light of reason threatened to illuminate the very shadows where the archive had thrived for centuries. The leaders of the order found themselves trapped in a paradox of their own making. They were men of deep traditional faith, yet their daily work required them to behave like cold, calculating atheists. They had to systematically dismantle every proof of the divine to ensure the survival of the institution that claimed to represent it. This friction between faith and control became an explicit, agonizing struggle in the private journals of the High Chancellor during the mid-18th century. He wrote of a spiritual vertigo that came from staring into the eyes of a person who performed a true miracle and then having to order their immediate deletion from the world. The archive maintained a specialized section known as the limbus, or the shelf of the unresolved. This was where the cases that defied even the most rigorous sanitization were placed. These were individuals who could not be broken by isolation, whose miracles could not be explained away as coincidences, and whose presence seemed to physically alter the structure of the stones around them. The limbus was a place of high anxiety for the sentinels. It represented the failure of their system. To have an unresolved case was to admit that there was a power in the world that was greater than the archive's ability to hide it. The air in this sector was said to be perpetually charged with a static energy that made the hair on the scribes' necks stand on end, a silent, vibrating reminder of the truths they could not kill. In the early summer of 1742, a secret reorganization of the archive was initiated under the title The Compendium of Silence. While the public world was occupied with the War of the Austrian Succession, the High Order was focused on a much more intimate conflict. On June 15, 1742, a lead-line trunk was brought from a remote monastery in the Alps to the central vaults. It contained the Singing Parchment, a document recovered from a candidate in 1690 that appeared to generate its own internal music, a sequence of notes that perfectly mirrored the mathematical ratios of the planetary orbits. The official log of that day shows that 3 scribes were permanently reassigned to the sub-level of the deaf after they were found trying to transcribe the melody into a public musical score. This precise historical detail illustrates the lengths to which the order would go to prevent the celestial truth from becoming an earthly song. The psychological toll on the High Order was not just limited to the scribes. It reached into the very heart of the leadership. They began to realize that by suppressing the divine, they were inadvertently starving their own spirits. The archive had become a desert of the soul. The confessions of the senior monks during this period are filled with a desperate, whispered longing for the very miracles they were tasked with burying. They began to seek out the resonant objects in the middle of the night, risking their lives just to touch a piece of cloth or a stone that had been in the presence of the anointed. They were like men dying of thirst in a room filled with locked canteens. The struggle reached its peak in the year 1780. When a group of internal dissenters attempted to leak the registry of the vanished to a prominent philosopher in Paris, they believed that the world was finally ready to handle the weight of the truth. The order's response was swift and total. The dissenters were not just stopped, they were integrated into the archive itself. Their identities erased and their memories neutralized through the use of sensory saturation. The lesson was clear. Once you enter the archive, you are no longer a citizen of the world. You are a component of the silence. The tension between the desire to believe and the duty to control had created a prison with no exit, where the jailers were just as trapped as the prisoners. Deep within the records of the 1790s, there is a recurring mention of a room with no door. The blueprints of the archive show a perfect square of empty space in the center of the northern wing, but there is no entrance or exit marked on any map. For generations, the younger scribes believed it was a ventilation shaft or a structural support. But a secret memo from 1805 suggests that the room contains a candidate whose body is made of coherent light. The memo claims that the light is so intense it can pass through solid lead, and that the only way to contain it is through a continuous, rhythmic chanting performed by a rotating shift of 12 monks who never stop for a single second. What happens if one of those monks misses a beat? And is it the chant that is keeping the light in, or is it the light that is keeping the monks alive? As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, imagine the steady, hypnotic rhythm of that chanting. It is the heartbeat of the archive, the sound of a desperate human effort to hold back the infinite. The walls of the stone vaults are cold, but the air inside is warm with the friction of secrets that refuse to stay buried. The silence is not a lack of sound. It is a heavy, pressurized force that demands your absolute surrender. You are deep within the heart of the mystery now, in a place where names no longer matter and the only truth is the one. You are not allowed to know that the modern era did not bring an end to the archive. It merely changed the medium of the silence. As the industrial world gave way to the digital age, the High Order realized that the most effective way to remove a name from history was no longer to burn a scroll, but to bury it under a mountain of algorithmically generated noise. They developed the doctrine of the infinite static, where a true miracle is not hidden, but is instead surrounded by a million fake versions of itself, until the public can no longer tell the difference between the divine and the fabricated. The moral tension that once lived in the hearts of the monks now lives in the cold logic of the server rooms. The struggle between faith and control has moved from the altar to the interface. Yet the weight of the unsaid remains just as heavy, the psychological toll on the modern Guardians is a unique form of digital exhaustion. They spend their days monitoring the pulse of the global internet, looking for the one video, the one testimony, or the one anomalous data point that suggests a return. They are the editors of our reality, ensuring that the names removed from history stay removed. They have seen the evidence of things that would shatter the current social order, yet they must click delete to maintain the peace of the collective. The archive has become a global network of suppressed potential, a digital void where the most profound secrets of our species go to die in the dark dock in the late winter of 1888. A significant event occurred within the high-security wing of the archive's London branch. While history remembers that year for the atmospheric terror of the East End, the secret records describe the great categorization of the unspoken. On December 12, 1888, a ledger containing the genetic lineages of 32 high-resonance families was sealed in a vault beneath the Thames. The records state that these families were the direct descendants of the candidates who had been vanished during the Roman era. The decision to monitor these lineages was based on the fear that the divine signal was not just a historical event, but a biological one that could be reactivated at any moment. This precise historical detail shows that the archive's mission had shifted from managing the past to preemptively controlling the future. As you reach the final moments of this deep dive into the archive, let the weight of these centuries rest gently on your mind. The rooms, the rituals, and the silent men were all part of a single, massive effort to keep the world manageable. The archive is the ultimate testament to the human fear of the unknown. We chose the safety of the known over the glory of the true. Every name removed from history is a missing piece of the puzzle of who we are. The silence is the price we pay for a world that makes sense. But as you drift into the quietest part of the night, remember that the archive is only a building and the truth is an ocean. Even the strongest walls eventually yield to the tide, but even as the archive perfects its digital silence, a new anomaly has been detected in the deep vaults, a sound that should not exist. It is the sound of a name being whispered from inside a stone that was sealed in the year 1241, and as the guards rush to investigate, they find that every single page of the Registry of the Vanished has begun to turn white, as if the ink itself is fleeing from what is about to happen next. What occurs when the names we removed from history decide to write themselves back in? Imagine that the greatest threat to your existence is not a war, a plague, or a famine, but a single sentence currently locked in a lead-lined safe beneath the heart of the world. For decades, the sovereign shepherds of the High Order have sat in silence, looking at evidence that would instantly dissolve every currency, every government, and every religious structure on the planet. This is the ultimate betrayal of the human spirit. They have seen the proof of the impossible and decided that you are not worthy of knowing it. This is not a secret hidden by accident. It is a forbidden containment of a spiritual catastrophe. The leaders of the Silent City possess the records of a truth so heavy it could crush the mind of anyone unprepared for its weight. They have chosen to let you live in a curated, comfortable lie because the alternative is a total collapse of the collective psyche. They keep the seals intact because they know that once the truth is released, the version of you that currently exists will cease to be. This is a curse of forced ignorance, a strategic preservation of a reality that has already been proven false behind closed doors. They keep the world in a state of permanent, spiritual infancy to prevent a transformation they cannot control. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold, unyielding weight of a stone door that has not moved in a century. There are no sounds of the modern world here, only the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock that measures time in generations rather than minutes. We are standing at the threshold of the final seal, the place where the silence is absolute and the secrets are eternal. Let the noise of your life fade into the shadows, and listen to the whisper of the forgotten. The question that haunts the corridors of the modern archive is no longer what is hidden, but why the doors remain closed. The sovereign shepherds are men of profound education and supposed transparency, yet they guard these vaults with a tenacity that borders on the fanatical. To understand their refusal, one must understand the specific terror of a total answer. For thousands of years, the human heart has thrived in the space between doubt and certainty. Faith is a muscle that grows in the resistance of the unknown. If the archive were opened, if the cold, clinical proof of the divine were laid bare for all to see, the very nature of belief would change. It would move from a choice of the soul to a fact of the mind. The leaders argue in their private journals that humanity is not ready for the end of mystery. They believe that a world without secrets is a world without hope. If every miracle were verified and every candidate's history revealed, the divine would become just another branch of physics, another data point in a textbook. The moral fear that keeps the seals intact is the fear of a soft collapse, a state where the human spirit loses its drive to seek because it has already found everything. They see themselves as the protectors of your wonder, the curators of the shadow that allows the light of your own faith to shine. In the spring of 1953, during a period of massive archival reorganization, a senior librarian named Cardinal Domenico Tardini was reportedly found sitting on the floor of the lower vaults, staring at a single, unlabeled file. The official log from May 12th of that year contains a brief, handwritten note in the margin. It states that the cardinal refused to eat for 3 days, claiming that he had finally understood why the seal of 1241 could never be broken. He wrote that the truth was not a message for the world, but a mirror that showed the world its own ending. This historical detail marks the beginning of the modern policy of eternal containment. It was after this event that the High Order moved from a strategy of hiding information to a strategy of active, psychological gatekeeping, ensuring that even the most high-ranking officials were never allowed to see the complete picture of the final case. The psychological layer of this silence is deep and unsettling. The guardians of the archive are not merely hiding facts. They are managing a global equilibrium. They believe that releasing the truth would lead to a state of collective paralysis. If you knew, beyond any shadow of doubt, that the material world was a mere reflection of a more potent reality, would you still go to work? Would you still pay your taxes? Would you still participate in the slow, rhythmic dance of a society built on the assumption of death? The archive remains sealed because the sovereign shepherds know that the current world is a house of cards, and the truth is a wind that would blow it all away. As you listen to the steady flow of this story, consider the toll this takes on the men who hold the keys. They live in a state of permanent melancholic solitude. They are the only ones who know the full extent of the lie, yet they are forbidden from ever speaking it. They walk the halls of the silent city like ghosts in a museum of their own making. They have seen the confessions that were never meant to be read, and they have touched the stones that still hum with the resonance of the anointed. Their faith is not a comfort, it is a burden. They believe not because they choose to, but because they have no other option. They are the prisoners of their own certainty. The final case recorded in the secret ledger is perhaps the most haunting of all, for it is the only one that ends without a resolution, a conclusion, or even a name. In the winter of 1998, the motion sensors in the deepest sublevel of the archive were triggered by something that defied every law of physical security. The digital monitors captured a figure standing in the center of the hallway, a space that requires 3 biometric keys and a high-level clearance just to enter. The figure did not move, did not speak, and did not appear on any of the heat signature scanners. For 12 continuous hours, the sentinels watched through the glass as the figure slowly began to glow with a soft, bioluminescent light that eventually saturated the entire camera frame. When the light finally faded, the hallway was empty once again. In the exact spot where the figure had stood, the guards found a single, Silver coin from a civilization that has not existed for 4,000 years. The High Order has spent decades trying to analyze the metal, but the results remain the same. It is composed of an alloy that does not exist in our periodic table. On September 23, 1998, a classified memo was circulated among the 12 highest-ranking members of the Order, titled The Zero-Point Emergence. This document remains the only official acknowledgement of a candidate who could not be contained by any physical, digital, or psychological barrier. The report suggests that the figure was not an intruder from the outside, but a manifestation of the archive's own suppressed energy, a spontaneous eruption of the very light they had spent centuries trying to bury. This historical detail underscores the terrifying possibility that the archive has become so saturated with the divine that it is beginning to leak into our reality like a cracked dam. The realization that faith requires not knowing is the final, bitter pill that the modern guardians must swallow in the silence of their vigil. They have come to realize that if the archive were to open, the mystery that fuels the human heart would be replaced by a cold, clinical certainty. We would no longer be seekers, we would merely be spectators. The melancholy that hangs over the silent city is the knowledge that the greatest gift the Order can give to humanity is the gift of the shadow. They keep the door locked so that you may continue to dream. They keep the names removed so that you may continue to hope. It is a profound and lonely sacrifice of the truth for the sake of the human spirit. They are the ones who bear the weight of the answer so that you may enjoy the beauty of the question dot as the final candles of this story flicker and begin to fade. Ask yourself a single question. If you were handed the heavy iron key to the archive tonight, would you truly have the courage to turn the lock? Would you be willing to trade the comfort of your current life for a truth that would make your entire world feel like a single grain of sand on an infinite, dark beach? Perhaps the silence you hear in your room right now is not an absence of sound at all. Perhaps it is the presence of a truth that is simply too loud for human ears to perceive. A truth that is waiting for the moment you finally close your eyes to whisper your real name. The world above continues its rhythmic, busy dance, unaware of the deep silence that supports its every step. The stone vaults remain cold, the ledgers remain closed, and the guardians continue their solitary, candle-lit watch. There are no hard answers here, only the steady, hypnotic pulse of a history that was never meant to be told. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment remains. You are safe within the mystery. You are at home in the unknown. The story does not end. It merely waits for you in the shadows of the next dream, but as the final gate is locked for the night, a single rhythmic tapping can be heard from the other side of the stone. It is a signal, a code that has not been used in 2,000 years. And as the last light goes out, we must ask ourselves the final question. If the archive was built to keep the world out, what happens to us when the truth finally decides to knock from the inside?